So two of their front three, you could argue that football-wise, they might be better off without from next season. Really, I mean, Julien Laurent said to me on 5 Live last night, it isn't Messi's talent that's in question, but at his age, on the counter-attack, Goretzka catches him up from 5 yards behind. So football-wise, losing maybe Messi and Neymar could improve them. But commercially, that could be disastrous for them, couldn't it?
Yeah, and this strikes at the heart of PSG's problem, that marketing decisions and footballing decisions have not gone hand in hand, and occasionally signings have been made that made a lot more commercial sense than sporting sense. Did PSG really need to sign Lionel Messi? I mean, it sounds like an absurd thing to say, because of course every club in the world is going to want to sign Lionel Messi if you can. And given the sort of salary he commands, PSG were one of maybe 2 or 3 clubs who could have even envisaged such a transfer. But looking at what they needed on the pitch, did they need to sign him? Arguably not. Did they need to sign Gianluigi Donnarumma when Keylor Navas has been one of the best goalkeepers in Europe for the last 4 or 5 years and never put a foot wrong for PSG in the Champions League? Arguably not. And this is the problem with PSG, that, you know, they have appointed coaches who have very clear ideas about the kind of football that they want their teams to play. But every single one of those coaches, whether that's Unai Emery, whether that's Thomas Tuchel, whether that's Mauricio Pochettino, they all have their hands tied because there are 3 players who don't really like running very much. And sure, you know, do everything else you need to do. You know, you're free to do what you want to do on the training ground and set the team up as you like, and we won't interfere with that. But these 3, Neymar runs around a little bit. The other 2 don't really like running very much. So if you could just factor that in, and at the very highest level, you can't get away with that. You know, this season is slightly different in that Christophe Galtier is not a kind of a coach with a particularly expansive football philosophy. You know, he kind of built his success on playing counter-attacking football with Lille, most notably winning the league in 2021, and then at Nice with less success. So you know, he you know, is not a kind of philosopher coach as Jose Mourinho might have termed it. But again, he's another coach whose desire to create a team that plays football a certain way has been undermined by the fact that they sign these superstar players who just won't run.
But the Paris Saint-Germain fans would go with patience to build that, wouldn't they? Because there has been disconnect between the Paris Saint-Germain fans and the superstar element of this team.
Yeah, I mean, you go back to last year when they got eliminated at the same stage of this competition by Real Madrid, and in the first game at Parc des Princes, Neymar and Messi were booed. I mean, how'd you boo Messi? You know, yeah. no matter what sporting shortcomings he's been partly responsible for, but it was a way of saying, you know, we reject this. We reject the kind of the bling bling culture. And, you know, Neymar is not massively popular with PSG's fans. Messi doesn't really have any kind of bond with PSG's fans. Even Kylian Mbappe, who was spared the booing this time last year, is not loved in the way that other players have been loved, not quite as wholeheartedly as other players have been loved, because there's been the kind of constant fluttering of the eyelashes towards Real Madrid. And even though he ended up staying last summer, you know, come the autumn, there were stories as well that, you know, he felt like he'd made a mistake and still wanted to leave. So, you know, there is within the PSG fan base frustration at the fact that the club is stuck in this sort of Champions League Groundhog Day. And as much as we talk about them as the nouveau riche, as the arriviste, and as much as people delight in their failures, you know, PSG fans for the most part are sort of normal football fans. I mean, you know, you remember this, Chab, as you mentioned it before. I remember when I first moved to Paris, pre-Qataris, the Parc des Princes was an electrifying place to go and watch football, a proper atmosphere. And they had problems with crowd violence that they, you know, correctly addressed. But, you know, the fans reject this idea that this is a club with only 12 years of history that the club was born the day the Qataris arrived, and they would much rather get back to the days when perhaps they weren't in the headlines quite as much, but they also weren't a laughingstock either.
Is it fair to judge Paris Saint-Germain, or indeed any major European club, on simply what they do in the Champions League, which, as I've said many times, is still essentially a cup competition?
I mean, it is and it isn't. It is because they are one of the most well-resourced clubs in football history, and they have assembled an incredible collection of world-famous footballers. They dominate their domestic league, and winning the Champions League has been their stated ambition ever since the Qataris bought the club in 2011. But it isn't because, as you say, it's a cup competition, and there are lots of very well-resourced clubs who haven't come close to winning the Champions League during that period. Manchester City still haven't won the Champions League. Pep Guardiola hasn't won the Champions League since he left Barcelona, and he is undoubtedly the great coach of his age. So it's not an automatic thing. I think the reason that people sort of take a lot of relish in PSG's repeated failings is because we know how much money they have, and they seem to go about things in the wrong way, in a very obvious way. They seem to make very obvious mistakes. They seem to put the emphasis in the wrong places, and with the same results season after season. So I think given their resources, given the extent of their domestic dominance, it is not unreasonable to have expected them to have done better than one Champions League final since the Qataris arrived in 2011. I mean, 5 last 16 exits in the last 7 years. That's it's a sign of consistency, but not the kind of consistency you want. But yes, we shouldn't overlook the caveat that throwing money at the Champions League, even having an extremely well-run club and an excellent team, an excellent manager, none of those things are guarantees of winning it.